the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is our National Day of Prayer, and in the second hour, we're going to spend a little more time talking about that. 144 national calls for prayer, humiliation, fasting, and thanksgiving by presidents of the United States, and we will spend some time looking at those most recent proclamations. But also, one of the other things that we will be talking about a little bit later is that on this National Day of Prayer, President Donald Trump decided to sign this executive order on religious liberty. It's something we've encouraged you to contact him about. We've made it possible through our action alerts to do so. And as he was in the Rose Garden, surrounded by a number of religious leaders, this is what he had to say.
Our founding fathers believed that religious liberty was so fundamental that they enshrined it in the very First Amendment of our great and beloved Constitution. Yet for too long, the federal government has used the power of the state as a weapon against people of faith, bullying and even punishing Americans for following their religious beliefs. That's been happening. That is why I am signing today an executive order to defend the freedom of religion and speech in America, the freedoms that we've wanted, the freedoms that you fought for so long, and we are doing it in just a little while right over here.
So again, some of the comments, we'll spend some more time in the second hour talking about that. And of course, we also have a vote taking place today, at least scheduled for today, and that is in the House of Representatives on repeal and replace of the Affordable Care Act. So we have a lot to cover, and we will certainly do that. But one of the things that we also want to do from time to time is educate you about very important issues. One of those that we've talked about in the past but haven't really dealt with recently, and that's why we thought it would be good to bring this guest back to the microphone, is the issue of sustainable development. Perhaps you've also heard of the Agenda 21, and this is a good example of a globalist idea that, interestingly enough, has made its way into your local communities. So we bring back to the microphone Tom DeWeese, an individual that has for many years been addressing some of these very important issues. And so we want to give you a chance to not only learn about this, but also learn about him. He's the president of the American Policy Center, one of the leading advocates for individual liberty and free enterprise, private property rights, an individual that has actually addressed these issues on this program and at major universities for many years. So, Tom, welcome back to Point of View.
Thanks a lot, Kirby. It's good to be with you.
You know, one of the things I guess we need to do, since it has been a while since we've had you on the program, even though we occasionally talk about this, is maybe get a few definitions. And, of course, the obvious first one is sustainable development. These are a good example of, and as some of these other phrases we're going to use, all sound very positive, and they're chosen in that regard. But sustainable development, though it sounds our lifestyle dramatically, couldn't it?
Absolutely, and it is. Sustainable development, they sell this as protecting the environment, that we're protecting our natural resources, we're preserving them for future generations. That's the argument that they give, that's the excuse they give. In reality, what they're doing is locking these things away, and I've asked the question many times, somewhere in the future, at what point does somebody, a bureaucrat in charge, say, okay, now we're going to open up these natural resources for new generations? I don't see that happening. What I see is people, and in fact they advocate, people have to learn to live on less. And every year it becomes less and less and less. And cutting our carbon footprint is one of the other things that you'll hear, and I say a lot that if you have no carbon footprint, you are dead. So this is what sustainable development is, a scare tactic that is used to get you to give up your liberties in the name of protecting the environment, but in reality, it doesn't protect the environment. It actually, in many cases, a lot of sustainable policies damage the environment.
And again, we have a link to your website. Matter of fact, we've posted one article, but people can find many more. But let's, if we can, maybe mention 2 or 3 other phrases that you hear, because again, Tom, these will sound really good. And if you're at a city council meeting hearing somebody say that, if you're a mayor saying that, if you see a global summit saying this sounds good. Things like social equity, economic prosperity. I mean, after all, who's not for economic prosperity? But these have different meanings for people that are really behind Agenda 21, aren't they?
Well, they do. And the social equity, the logo for sustainable development that they use in their documents, you will see this over and over again in various ways. They have 3 connecting circles, and these 3 circles are all labeled. One is labeled social equity, one is labeled ecological integrity, one is labeled economic prosperity. And we call these the 3 E's. And, you think that, as you said, all these sound very good. Social equity is the most important one of these. This encompasses every single thing in your life. Social justice is the other word that we hear.
Right.
This leads to controlling every aspect of your life. It's a redistribution of wealth. And one of the things in the just recently, last year or so, the UN had another one of these massive meetings, and they came out with a new adjustment of Agenda 21, calling it Agenda 2030. It had 17 different points on what they intended to do. These were their goals. And the first 3 really dealt with eradicating poverty. But their answer to eradicating poverty is redistribution of wealth, taking it out of your pocket and putting it into somebody else's. And it's very interesting that, for decades and decades and decades, we've had programs that have been aimed at eliminating poverty all over the world. You have huge organizations that are set up to address this. You have massive amounts of government money used to address this. And the interesting thing is you end up with more poor. It's a growth industry. I call it the compassion cartel because it's all based on redistribution of wealth, taking from this group to give to that group. Eventually, they take so much that now you need the assistance because they've taken so much of your hard-earned cash. So, this is one of the major fallacies of this entire program. It doesn't work because it's based on the very premise that it has been proven not to work.
Tom DeWeese with us, and he is with the American Policy Center. When we come back, we're going to talk about who's behind this, and perhaps in your local community, you've heard mayors, city council people talking about smart growth. And again, who's not for smart growth, and even the idea of green jobs and green building codes. But what about this idea of sustainability and sustainable growth, and this idea of sustainable development, and in particular, who's behind Agenda 21 and now the more recent one, and how to begin to identify that in your local community and what we can do about it. So those are just a few issues we're going to put on the table. And as always, if you'd like to join us, perhaps you've heard some of this before in your local community, this is a great opportunity for you to sort of report back to us. So if you would like to join the conversation today, that number is 1-800-351-1212. We've posted one article by Tom DeWeese as well as a link to his website. The website's easy to find because it's simply americanpolicy.org. But we also have posted an article we'll get into in just a minute on sustainable development, real and fake. So we have a lot more to cover. We will do that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Today is the National Day of Prayer. It is a vital part of our American heritage. The first call to prayer happened before the American Revolution. In 1775, the Continental Congress called on the colonists to pray for wisdom as they considered how they would respond to the King of England. Perhaps one of the most powerful calls to prayer came from President Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. In 1863, he issued a proclamation for a day of humiliation, fasting, and prayer. Here is some of that proclamation. He said, "We have been the recipients of the choicest bounties of heaven. We have been preserved these many years in peace and prosperity. We have grown in numbers, wealth, and power as no other nation has ever grown. But we have forgotten God. We have forgotten the gracious hand which preserved us in peace and multiplied and enriched and strengthened us. We have vainly imagined in the deceitfulness of our hearts that all these blessings were produced by some superior wisdom and virtue of our own. Intoxicated with unbroken success, we have become too self-sufficient to feel the necessity of redeeming and preserving grace, too proud to pray to the God that made us." In 1952, Congress passed and President Harry Truman signed a resolution declaring an annual National Day of Prayer. In 1988, President Reagan signed into law a bill that designated the first Thursday of May at the time for a National Day of Prayer. It is estimated that there have been more than 130 national calls to prayer, humiliation, fasting, and thanksgiving by presidents of the United States. There have been 60 presidential proclamations for a National Day of Prayer because every president has signed these proclamations. Today is the National Day of Prayer. Please pray for this nation and its leaders. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Tom DeWeese with us today, and he is the president of the American Policy Center. We have a link to that on our website, talking about Agenda 21, sustainable development, a variety of other issues, all sort of collected together there. A little bit later, one of the other articles is, should we continue to pay for the United Nations? Donald Trump just recently ordered the State Department to slash $5 billion from the UN budget, so we'll talk about some of that as well as we get into the broader issue of globalism. But let's stay on the topic for just a minute, Tom. A lot of people might say, I don't know if I've heard about this, but I have heard about sustainability or sustainable development. Let's talk about who's behind this, because some of our global issues happen in Geneva. They happen in New York City at the United Nations. But most of our listeners probably live in a community or live near a community that has actually adopted this idea of Agenda 21 and sustainability. Fair?
Yeah, absolutely. The fact is that almost every single community in the country has some form of this in place. And the way this really started, the root to it, there was the Earth Summit back in 1992, sponsored by the United Nations in Rio de Janeiro, and this is where Agenda 21 was introduced. But they had had a series of meetings before that, kind of leading up to it, piece by piece. These planks were put together. There are literally thousands of non-governmental organizations that work inside the United Nations. They are actually authorized to be there. They help write these documents. They have their own private agendas for specific issues. These are groups like the Sierra Club, the Nature Conservancy, even the National Education Association, Planned Parenthood. These are all UN NGOs, and they're involved in putting this together. Well, they came together with this big culmination, this major document called Agenda 21, which they called a comprehensive blueprint for the reorganization of human society. That's what they called it. That's a pretty big statement. And American President George H.W. Bush, who was president at the time, signed on to it. And what happened from that point forward were these NGO groups that helped write it went into our federal bureaucracy, they went into the Congress, and they began to help write grant programs and other kinds of programs to put this together. The president, Bill Clinton then was president, put together the President's Council on Sustainable Development. And this is how it became the rule of law in the United States. Through the President's Council, its job was to implement Agenda 21, and they put these grant programs together, and these grants had very specific strings attached. If a community took the grant, then they had to do certain things. Those certain things were the implementation of processes of Agenda 21. This would be, there's an international rules on electrical use, on plumbing use. There, you see in your communities, you'll see the bike lanes and things like that. These are all kind of signs of it. But this is all based on international policy to cut back on energy use and control growth in the community. And so this is how it came down into your neighborhood through HUD, through the EPA, through the Department of Transportation, grants through all those. They have very specific programs for it, and that's how it got there.
And I think, again, as I was illustrating in the first segment, really helping individuals define their terms. You know, when you hear things like smart growth, well, that makes sense, or green jobs, or green building codes, or going green. I mean, there is a sense in which, obviously, we want to be good stewards of the planet. But sometimes those phrases or those words are co-opted to promote this Agenda 21. Isn't that right?
Well, it's true. And as I said earlier, these are fear tactics. This is to make you afraid. If they came out and said, we are going to now implement the wisdom of Karl Marx, we would all reject it. But if we put it all into, it doesn't matter how many rights you think you have, but if you don't have a planet to stand on, what good's it going to do you? And, so that kind of a scare tactic, people started accepting these very ideas that were completely contrary to how our country was established, how we progressed, how we moved forward. And one of the main targets of sustainable policy is free enterprise. They see that as a means to degrade the planet, and that people having freedom of choice, being able to do things in their own lives, are the danger. And take that down even another step, then one of the major targets is private property ownership. They believe that private property ownership is a social injustice, and that we have to have government control over the property in order to make sure that you're doing the right thing on your property.
Well, again, I've got some of the quotes in front of me here where, for example, the UN's Habitat Conference saying land cannot be treated as an ordinary asset controlled by individuals and subject to the pressures and inefficiencies of the market. Private land ownership is also a principal instrument of the accumulation and concentration of wealth, therefore contributes to social injustice. Well, right in that one quote, you have a criticism of free markets, a criticism of you having any kind of private property rights, and a criticism of allowing a free market to determine what individuals can do. So you couldn't have a more blatant statement, and that's just one of many that illustrate kind of the mindset behind those, if you will, social engineers, globalists that want to really kind of completely restructure our society.
Yeah, let me give you one more. In a 1993 publication out of the United Nations, they described Agenda 21 like this. Agenda 21 proposes an array of actions which are intended to be implemented by every person on Earth. It calls for specific changes in the activities of all people. Effective execution of Agenda 21 will require a profound reorientation of all humans, unlike anything the world has ever experienced. Wow.
Unbelievable. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212, and we will certainly talk about how we can respond. And, of course, part of that is to give you, as we have, a link to the American Policy Center. Well, let me see if I can grab a phone call here, because this is one caller I think wanted to know if there are some connections to some other aspects of Agenda 21. So, Joey in Georgia, you're on with Tom DeWeese. What's your comment or question?
Hi, we were just wondering about any connections to Jade Helm within this Agenda 21 framework.
Yeah, Jade Helm. What about that? Is that related to that at all?
Well, it's interesting because I just read a report yesterday that some details are coming out about what that really was about, and it was really the movement towards martial law and total control. And this is really what we're talking about. We're talking about total control of government over every aspect of our lives. And if you're intent on putting that total control in place, then you certainly can't have different points of view and people opposing these things. And they have become desperate to get these things in place. And so, yeah, I think in a way, yes, I think you can make a connection there from the fact that it is really a drive to establish government control.
And again, that was sort of a military exercise. So in some respects, it's a little different than, of course, Agenda 21. But there's what I sometimes use as co-belligerents. In other words, they're not necessarily wearing the same uniform, but they're firing in the same direction, if that makes sense, because sometimes they don't necessarily always work together, although sometimes, as you know, Tom, these boards are interlocking. But when you start seeing how the agenda is moved forward, sometimes it's moved forward by individuals that really aren't necessarily known as environmentalists. You just mentioned a minute ago, one of the NGOs is Planned Parenthood. Well, that sort of relates to the environment, but sort of not. Sierra Club sort of relates to it. Some of these others may be a little more distant, but they're all kind of moving in the same direction because ultimately the goal is pretty much the same, isn't it?
Yeah, well, you take a look at the incredible pushback that has been taking place since Donald Trump was elected, because he said he was going to push back on a lot of these things. He was going to reestablish a limited government, reestablish property rights, reestablish free enterprise. And you just look at the incredible what's going on across the country, this pushback that most people are sitting there going, what? What's this about? These people are desperate to stop any kind of pushback of what they had. They were so close to total control, and now all of a sudden they're losing that. And one of the things is people are starting to wake up to this. We've been traveling the country for 20 years describing this and talking about it, lots of times talking to empty halls. That is beginning to change. I'm starting to hear from local elected representatives and city councilmen, people like that, who are saying, what do we do? How do we stop this? That never happened before. So people are beginning to recognize what the danger is.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, I want to point you to one of the articles we've posted, which will again take you to AmericanPolicy.org, Sustainable Development, Real and Fake, and 3 Faces of Sustainability. Also another article that Tom DeWeese has posted there, the Trump administration wanting to cut back the UN budget. And so I'd love to get your thoughts about that as well. Should we get out of the UN, and should the UN get out of the United States? Love to get your comments. 1-800-351-1212. We'll continue our conversation with Tom DeWeese right after this.
In an age of fake news, getting good information is vital. Point of View works to bring you that each and every day. But as Diane in Arkansas illustrates, passing that information along, educating others, is something you can help with. Diane is a college professor. She influences the next generation, and she wrote, "Thank you for your informative letter. I used some of your quotes when I was teaching the Declaration of Independence in my literature class." Diane, like so many, hopefully like you, is taking what she received from Point of View in letters, online, through our app, on the air, and rebuilding truth in this post-truth culture. All of that takes a team. Join the Truth Team at Point of View. Find out how you can help at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or sign up online at pointofview.net/team. Show your commitment. Make a difference today, right now. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View.
The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
I'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Might mention that we have posted some information that we'll be talking about in the second hour, having to do with, first of all, the National Day of Prayer, and also this executive order that was signed by President Trump on the issue of religious liberty. So if you go to our website right now, on the sidebar there, Conservatives Dissatisfied with Trump's Executive Order, that gives you an article that I think summarizes some of the benefits, but a lot of the drawbacks. There was a lot that was removed from this original draft of the Executive Order on Religious Liberty. So that is posted, and in just a little bit we'll also, now that it has been posted on whitehouse.gov, the actual executive order, so you could read it for yourself. We'll spend some time in the second hour talking about it. And of course, we'll have full coverage on Friday because Kelly Shackelford will be in studio with us, as well as Penna Dexter. But we are talking at the moment with Tom DeWeese, and if you'd like to join our conversation, maybe it's shown up in your city council, or maybe you've been dealing with this for some time, or maybe you just have a question about what's actually taking place, feel free to give us a call. That number is 1-800-351-1212. And Tom, let's come back for just a minute before we get into some other issues to that significant issue of private property. Some of our listeners might say, well, I own the property, so if I want to put up trees, that's my decision. Or if I've got a ranch and I want to save some water and build a dam, there's no problem there. And if I want to actually plow an area that is sort of muddy part of the year, that's okay. And the first thing you'd find out is that all sorts of actions that you think would be permissible, since after all, you own the land, are not permitted because of whether it's EPA regulations or various edicts that have come down from the UN's Habitat for Humanity or the Earth Summit or whatever. We think we own the property until we start doing some things on that property, and we find out that this Agenda 21 could affect each one of us.
Yeah, the world you described, or, at the beginning, that you could do these things on your property, is the way the United States was established. And private property ownership has been proven to be the main way that the average person has to build their own personal wealth through the equity of their property. The equity in property has over 60% of the businesses in this country were started that way, using that kind of money, which led to like 60% of the American people working for companies that way. So really helping the economy. But the fact is today, as a property owner, you have the right to pay the taxes and you have the right to pay the mortgage. Beyond that, every single decision on your property is made by somebody behind closed doors somewhere. And as you said, there have been people who have built ponds on their property for the ducks and things like that. They've been fined, even put in jail for things like that. They've been fined and put in jail for having their grass too high, or if it dies. This kind of thing, this overreach of government. And, one of the things they say when we start trying to push back and talk about giving people the right to own and control their own property, for some reason, the example they always bring up is, if we don't have these kind of controls, somebody's going to put a stinky old pig farm next door to you. Apparently, they really hate pigs. I don't know, but
our
that's
listeners
always
in
the
Iowa
example.
right now are not thrilled about hearing that, I suppose. Yes.
Yeah, that's always the example
Yeah.
that they bring up. But the fact of the matter is that if you have somebody establishing something next door that damages your property, whether it's a stinky old pig farm or it's a bright light shining or a loud music or anything like that, since the beginning of human settlements, we've had the right to redress these through nuisance laws. And what they try to do with Agenda 21 Sustainable Development Policies is a one-size-fits-all, everybody has to follow this no matter what. And what you end up with is no property rights at all, no decision on your, that you can make on your own property. And what we're seeing now is property rights are diminishing in this country. If they're under attack, then we're seeing the economy begin to also diminish. which fits right in with a pattern when you don't have property rights. And just one thing, a rancher, Wayne Hage, out in Nevada, he's now deceased, but he was one of the first ranchers that were attacked by the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, and the horrible things that they did to him. His case is still in the courts, but he has since been deceased. But he said at the time, if you don't have the right to own and control property, then you are property. And I think that pretty well sums it up.
Certainly does. And again, let's talk about the United Nations. And let me just read a little bit from the UN's Biodiversity Assessment Report, in which they talked about things that were not sustainable. Plowing of soil, we just mentioned that. Building fences, the idea, even single-family homes are not really sustainable. The idea of paved roads, logging activities, dams and reservoirs. And it doesn't have to be a big dam. It could just be a little pond that you put out, like you said, for the ducks. Power line construction. All sorts of things are in that list. And so that kind of brings me to one of the other articles that you've posted, and that is the decision by this administration and by this president to slash funds from the United States to the United Nations. After all, we pay, I think the last I heard was 22% of the budget, and we get almost 100% of the criticism. So it does seem to me that some people looking at what is coming from some of these UN conferences and UN reports, and then all the attacks on the United States and Israel and others at the United Nations, caused a lot of people to wonder, why are we in this organization?
Well, yeah, I mean, the United Nations has made it its purpose. It's moving to be a global government. All you need for a global government is the ability to tax, have your own court system, and have a military that can enforce it all. They've already got a court system that's established, an environmental court system, and they have been moving for decades to try to get the ability to tax, and in fact, they do in a lot of ways. But if they ever get the full ability to do that, then they're going to have unlimited funds to put all this in place, and they will get their own military. That makes them a global government. That's what their whole purpose is, what they're trying to establish. And in fact, I just read today the moving behind the scenes to create an environmental worldwide constitution that becomes a treaty that every nation signs on to, and then it becomes, now they've got their constitution if they do that. So I've believed for many, many decades that the United Nations is the most dangerous force on earth. This is the incubator for a lot of these ideas, and things that would be laughable in other places if it weren't they weren't so powerful. So yeah, Donald Trump has ordered the State Department to begin to slash the money that we spend to the United Nations. We not only pay a fourth of its budget, but we also pay for peacekeeping missions, and we supply the soldiers for them now, and so slash that by 50%. And a lot of people say, well, that's not enough. And I say, you know what? If we slash their budget, what we're paying them by 50%, they would be in a world of hurt, and that would be the beginning of the end of the United Nations. And if the United States gets out of the United Nations, we will be quickly followed by Israel, by Australia, and by several other countries. It will cease to exist overnight if we would do that.
What are your thoughts? 1-800-351-1212. Been talking about Agenda 21 and private property, as well as sustainability, and of course even the UN budget. So those are just a few issues we've put on the table. But the broader issue for just a minute, since we did kind of talk about this in terms of this whole global idea, and this is part of even a bigger agenda item than that. You've talked about different faces of sustainability, and some of those are political. Some of these decisions that are affecting us day to day aren't even made in the United States and aren't even made by government bureaucrats, as difficult as sometimes it is for somebody in Washington, D.C. to determine what I need. These are decisions being made in some of these UN conferences, aren't they?
Well, they are, and again, they have these conferences over and over and over again, and these NGOs are in the back rooms writing this stuff up, and then they get the world leaders there to agree to it, and then we're off and running. We just had we're having a lot of debate right now over the climate change treaty that Donald Trump is talking about getting us out of, and of course we have the trade agreements. Along the lines of NAFTA and GATT and things like that. We've got other ones now that are pushing. This is all aimed at a global economy, and one of the real targets of all these things and they've stated it over and over again, is that nation states, which is our country, independent nations, are a danger. The nation states are the source of war and depravity and all that kind of thing. So that we have to eliminate those. And that's what you're seeing. When you look at the whole immigration issue, for example, why are we taking all these people in? Why are they moving all over the country or all over the world? Because this is an attack on individual nations and trying to break down those national barriers and make us just one big global gobbledygook and one global city.
We're going to take a break. We'll come back and take some phone calls. Also talk about what you can do to begin to make a difference in your own community. All that coming up right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. In 1997, the Birdville Independent School District welcomed 2 students to their meetings. One student led the Pledge of Allegiance, while the other student delivered a statement of his own choosing, according to the school's policy of allowing student remarks. And that continued for years, most often in the form of an invocation during which the board members stood respectfully quiet with bowed head while the student prayed. That was all well and good until a humanist group sued, alleging the school boards are not legislative bodies and should not be permitted to have an invocation in the same way a state legislature, city council, or county commission does. Eventually, the case arrived before the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, where a 3-judge panel upheld the practice, stating, quote, legislative prayers are recited for the benefit of legislative officers. It would be nonsensical to permit legislative prayers but bar the legislative officers for whom they are being primarily recited from participating in the prayers in any way, unquote. The fact that students undertook to lead those invocations was of minimal concern. Quote, although it is possible to imagine a school board student expression practice that offends the Establishment Clause, the court explained, this one, under its specific facts, does not, unquote. This is a routine area of challenge by secularists, but one with limited success, since the long tradition of our country is one of support for prayer at public meetings. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading One Hope for Religious Freedom. Go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
DeWeese with us for a few more minutes, and if the calls continue, we'll certainly carry them into the second hour. Let's go first of all to the state of Texas. And John, thank you for joining our conversation today.
Hi, thank you very much for taking my call. It's very odd that the topic is this. We live in a predominantly agrarian society area of Texas. Our nearest town is 15 minutes away. That's 300 people. Mm-hmm. Our county tax office traditionally taxes the land, not typically the use of the land. It's Henderson County, by the way.
Right.
And all these sites or forms are available on their website. We applied for an extension to our ag exemption, and this year, the first time ever, they suddenly required all kinds of information about lease value, the number of animals that were being raised on the land, and things like that, the types of animal, how many animals per acre, what type of grass is being grown on that. And I thought, why in the world is coming through the tax office? If there's an agricultural issue, then it would be coming through that state agency, but not the tax office, not the county tax office. And I continued to dig for questions. And I said to my wife, this sounds like that Agenda 21 thing that I've heard on the radio just a few months ago. And I went and looked up Agenda 21, and sure enough, the new county forms for Henderson County, Texas, reflect almost identically with the requirements, the mandates that are in this Agenda 21 document you're talking about. And then when I heard this morning, or this afternoon, I thought, boy, I've got to call in and say, this is real life.
It is. And I so appreciate you saying this, because I know a lot of people out there in rural communities, or whether you're in an urban or suburban area, say, well, that probably doesn't affect me. And I've just been trying to drive home for many years. I know Tom has as well. It's coming to a city near you. It's coming to a town near you. It's coming to, in your case, a tax office near you. Tom, any comments?
Yeah, rural or city, this is affecting everyone. And in the more rural areas, you've probably heard of the Wildlands Project.
Right.
And this literally is about controlling 50% of all the land with no development whatsoever. We have talked for years about how the real plan is to herd people off of the rural areas, because you're out of control. They can't oversee you as well as people in the cities. They want to herd you into the cities. People say, oh, come on, how can they do that? They make it impossible to live in a rural area. That's how. They, whether it's overtaxing or it's regulations on what you do on your farms, or, taking away the use of septic tanks is one of the things that they do. They make it impossible to live there. And then they move you into the cities, and now they can control every single thing that you do. And people say, oh, that's just crazy. But if you look at smart growth, that is what it's about. They put a line around the city, and they say no growth will take place out of there. That's urban sprawl. We don't want that. And now they begin to control inside the city what kind of housing you live in, whether you can have cars or not. They're working to discourage having cars, which discourages your ability to move, and freedom of movement, and control energy use, on and on and on. And what happens then is that now that you've got this specific area that does not grow, when the population does, they keep herding people in there, it keeps growing, then the only place you have to grow is up. Now you get these massive high-rises that are put in place, and that's what people are living in. And now we're seeing the apartments and the size of them getting smaller and smaller. So this is smart growth, which is not smart, and it is that is pure Agenda 21 controlling people in the cities.
Well, John, we've been thinking about your area of the country, because I know you had some tornadoes there in Athens and Canton and places like that. And if nothing else, I hope you'll keep us posted on what you've been able to discover and some of the conversation, because if nothing else, you provide some reality to the conversation we're having here today.
Well, God bless you. We'll send you some information by email if I can. I'll send you the forms. Thank you.
Thank you, John, and I really appreciate you helping us understand what's happening out there in this particular case in Henderson County in Texas. Let's go to Ohio this time. WGGN. Stephen, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. I really appreciate you guys, and I get a lot of information. That's what it's about, and it's true information. It's not the fake news.
Thank you. If nothing else, I think our conversation with John showed that we're just not making this stuff up, right?
That is true. And the interesting thing is, as I was listening to, I actually downloaded the Agenda 21 so I could look to see, because I'd never heard of it. And I was interested to know. I see, it was in 1992, but that would have been during the Bush era.
That's right.
And was Bush involved in approving this?
He sure was. Remember he talked about this new world order, but Tom, fill in the gaps for him. Tom, do we still have you? I guess we lost Tom. Well, Tom, I guess we lost his in line, but let me just say that, yes, remember when George Herbert Walker...
Here.
Okay, there are. When George Herbert Walker Bush talked about this new world order, and there is a good example there of what was passed under a Bush administration, then, of course, reaffirmed under Clinton and all the way through next Bush and then also through Obama. So talk about that.
I didn't hear the whole call. I was kind of cut back. But
he was just wondering, was President George Herbert Walker Bush involved in signing this? And you've already said that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I'll tell you what, a lot of people say they want to blame Democrats for this. So the Republicans and the Democrats are equally to blame for all this. George W. Bush did more to impose Agenda 21 than Bill Clinton did. So, and then Barack Obama did more than that. It is kind of an established, everybody's doing it. This is the agenda. This is what we're going to do. Everybody understands that. And to talk about pulling back on any of this stuff, as I mentioned earlier, they just go ballistic over it.
Well, let's, again, just before I let you go here, talk about how people can get involved. And we have a link to American Policy Center. And if some of our listeners that would like to get involved have an opportunity to visit your website, they'll find some information. But I think, first of all, and most importantly, we just want people to begin to say, what if you hear about sustainable development, Agenda 21, anything like that in your city council, perk up your ears and pay attention. But as they go to your website, you've got all sorts of great resources for individuals, don't you?
We do. We've really been working on creating tools that are useful for people. First of all, give them the background, but then what to do about it. We've got just a little cheap booklet on there, which you can actually download for free off the website on Agenda 21 and how to stop it. That goes into some details on what people can do. We've got some other items like that as well, and so just go into the website and check those things out.
Well, very good. Tom, appreciate the work that you've been doing. Like you said, sometimes you've been speaking to empty halls or speaking to a handful of people, but all of a sudden I think people are looking around and saying, whoa, wait a minute, what's going on here in my local community? Or maybe we need to rethink whether or not we need to be sending all these funds to the United Nations, and maybe we should stop funding all of these United Nations conferences on climate change and on sustainability and on habitat and all the rest. So maybe your time has come after all these years. And so thank you so very much for once again joining us here on Point of View.
My pleasure. I'm feeling more energized than I have in a long time. We're doing a lot of stuff that you'll be hearing about here shortly.
So again, AmericanPolicy.org, and we have a link to Tom DeWeese. We also have one of his articles. You also can go to Agenda 21 Sustainable Development in One Easy Lesson. I've been using some of that to speak to, and then of course there's some other articles. So let's, if we can, take a break. We come back. I've got a lot to talk about today. First of all, of course, it's the National Day of Prayer. I want to give you a little bit of a history lesson on that. And then today, President Donald Trump has signed the executive order. WhiteHouse.gov has now posted it, so I have it in front of me, and we'll try to go through some of this today. And then, of course, our plan is tomorrow to recognize it. We'll probably also spend some more time talking about that with Kelly Shackelford. So let me encourage you in the second hour to join us. If you didn't get through in this first hour, I think some of you still have some comments, and we'll certainly take those if you want to hang on, or if you want to hang up and call back in about 10 minutes, that's fine too. But we have lots to cover in the second hour, and if you'd like to join us then as well, 1-800-351-1212. All of it's on our website, pointofview.net.
A 2013 survey asked people around the world whether sex without marriage is morally wrong. Every country where more than 90% said, yes, it's morally wrong, Islamic. The worst two, tied at 6% saying it's wrong, France and Germany, the nations of Calvin and Luther. Catholic Italy, 11%. Simply sad. The United States, well, 31%. Not even 1 in 3 thinks extramarital sex is morally wrong. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour, and if you would like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. In the first hour, we talked about Agenda 21 and sustainable development. Let me take a phone call left over from that hour, and then we're going to get into a couple of issues. First of all, today is the National Day of Prayer. Going to be talking about that. Also, President Trump has signed an executive order promoting free speech and religious liberty, and there is a vote pending on the repeal and replace of the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. So we have a lot to cover in this hour, but let's take a call left over from the last hour. We'll head up to Alaska, KJNP, and Patsy. Thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you for having me. First of all, I think that the UN is a total failure, and let's get rid of it. I don't think any world government, national government, state government are capable of serving the needs of all the people everywhere. They don't know what they are. And as far as Agenda 21 is concerned, and sustainable development, I have to wonder, don't these people know where their food is coming from?
How are we going to do this? Yeah.
And I know where it comes from.
I know.
It comes from farmers who are trying to serve the needs of the people as far as food's concerned. So let's leave it up to them.
I would think so. You know, again, what we're seeing is kind of a push away from the rural areas. And, of course, maybe they didn't have these multinational corporations run all the farms. But I don't know. I think farmers have it in their own best interest, and ranchers have it in their own best interest. And, of course, even any property owner has it in his or her own best interest to manage the property efficiently and effectively. And then to say that some bureaucrat in Washington, D.C., or in some cases, when we're talking about these globalist groups, someone in Geneva that has not even a clue as to what is necessary to sustain a farm, then determine what sustainability is just kind of ludicrous. But, of course, we know that there's an agenda behind it, and that's, of course, why we spent some time in that first hour talking about it. Let me get into some of the issues today. It is the National Day of Prayer, and I want to talk about that in just a minute. But if you've not heard, I did mention this in the first hour. We now have the executive order in our hands, and we also are posting that right now on our website, pointofview.net, so you can actually see this executive order promoting free speech and religious liberty. 3 major points, but unfortunately quite a bit left out. But today, before he signed the executive order, this is what President Donald Trump said.
Our founding fathers believed that religious liberty was so fundamental that they enshrined it in the very First Amendment of our great and beloved Constitution. Yet for too long, the federal government has used the power of the state as a weapon against people of faith, bullying and even punishing Americans for following their religious beliefs. That's been happening. That is why I am signing today an executive order to defend the freedom of religion and speech in America, the freedoms that we've wanted, the freedoms that you fought for so long, and we are doing it in just a little while right over here.
So again, Donald Trump is speaking today on this executive order. In the next segment, we're going to get into that in a little more detail, but so that we don't slight this National Day of Prayer, I did want to spend just a few minutes talking about this. And also, I want to open up the phones, as we have always done on these National Day of Prayers, to first of all, have you share with us what has happened in your community, and maybe even share what you think should be some of the really important prayers that we should offer today and tonight for the nation. Again, it is the first Thursday of May. The National Day of Prayer is one that has been actually put into being because of a couple of actions. Of course, we've had these various times of prayer and fasting and national humiliation that have actually taken place, but there was a very deliberate attempt to actually begin to make sure that this would happen on an annual basis. And so back in 1952, Congress passed and Harry Truman signed a resolution that declared an annual National Day of Prayer. The difficulty, it was still sort of happenstance, so that's why in 1988, President Reagan signed into law a bill that designated the first Thursday of May as a time for the National Day of Prayer. And of course, you have all these celebrations taking place across the country. Now, if you look at this, really since the first Continental Congress called for a National Day of Prayer in 1775, we've had, the best estimates are, more than 140 different national calls to prayer, humiliation, fasting, and thanksgiving. And those numbers actually are a couple of dates old, so there may be even a few since then. Every president has had a proclamation for the National Day of Prayer. A couple of presidents, that would be Gerald Ford, George H.W. Bush, and Barack Obama, actually signed multiple National Day of Prayer proclamations. And so that has been very significant as well. And then the best estimates are that there have been at least 1,400, and that number is probably low because these are just the ones we know of state and federal calls for national prayer since 1775. I mentioned that first call for prayer in 1775, so let me talk about that for just a minute. This was a time in which the Continental Congress asked the colonies to pray for wisdom in forming a nation. The call to prayer has continued, of course, throughout our history, and one of the more significant ones, which I'll read from in just a minute, is President Lincoln's proclamation of a day of humiliation, fasting, and prayer, which took place in 1863. Of course, we've already talked about some of the actions that have been taken. And, of course, the individual who is the chairwoman of this National Day of Prayer is Anne Graham Lotz. And a little bit later, if we have some time, I might read her national prayer, which is pretty amazing because I was surprised at how many times, almost 2/3 of the prayer, is about confession and repentance. And when I was with Anne Graham Lotz in Washington, D.C., when we had one of these prayer events a number of months ago, she would say, "We confess," and then we would confess. She would actually list it and then have the entire audience say, "We confess." But just before we go to a break, perhaps one of the most famous calls for prayer happened in 1863 when Abraham Lincoln said, "We have been the recipients of the choicest bounties of heaven. We have been preserved these many years in peace and prosperity. We have grown in numbers, wealth, and power as no other nation has ever grown. But we have forgotten God. We have forgotten the gracious hand which preserved us in peace and multiplied and enriched and strengthened us. And we have vainly imagined, in the deceitfulness of our hearts, that all these blessings were produced by some superior wisdom and virtue of our own. Intoxicated with unbroken success, we become too self-sufficient to feel the necessity of redeeming and preserving grace, too proud to pray to the God that made us." Incredible call to prayer that happened in 1863 during the Civil War. Of course, I will a little bit later maybe have a chance to read the national prayer being put forward by Anne Graham Lotz, who was one of many individuals who was there for the National Day of Prayer, and also part of those individuals that are part of the Evangelical Advisory Council that are meeting and have been meeting with Donald Trump. They had dinner last night together in the White House. They were here today for the prayer time, and we'll find out maybe a little bit later some of the conversations that were taking place. When we come back, I want to talk about this executive order. It is at least a good first step, but I think, as you will see, there were many things left out of this executive order that were in the original draft order. We'll talk about that and take your phone calls right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Today is the National Day of Prayer. It is a vital part of our American heritage. The first call to prayer happened before the American Revolution. In 1775, the Continental Congress called on the colonists to pray for wisdom as they considered how they would respond to the King of England. Perhaps one of the most powerful calls to prayer came from President Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. In 1863, he issued a proclamation for a day of humiliation, fasting, and prayer. Here is some of that proclamation. He said, "We have been the recipients of the choicest bounties of heaven. We have been preserved these many years. In peace and prosperity, we have grown in numbers, wealth, and power, as no other nation has ever grown. But we have forgotten God. We have forgotten the gracious hand which preserved us in peace and multiplied and enriched and strengthened us. We have vainly imagined in the deceitfulness of our hearts that all these blessings were produced by some superior wisdom and virtue of our own. Intoxicated with unbroken success, we have become too self-sufficient to feel the necessity of redeeming and preserving grace, too proud to pray to the God that made us." In 1952, Congress passed and President Harry Truman signed a resolution declaring an annual National Day of Prayer. In 1988, President Reagan signed into law a bill that designated the first Thursday of May as the time for a National Day of Prayer. It is estimated that there have been more than 130 national calls to prayer, humiliation, fasting, and thanksgiving by presidents of the United States. There have been 60 presidential proclamations for a National Day of Prayer because every president has signed these proclamations. Today is the National Day of Prayer. Please pray for this nation and its leaders. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Let's talk about this religious liberty executive order for just a minute. Of course, there have been some various people talking about what they thought would be in it, and even last night I received an outline that talked about the three major points of the executive order. Now that I'm looking at the executive order, I think the outline is pretty accurate. There are actually 5 sections, but realistically only 3 address some of those issues. And so that's one of the reasons why we posted this particular article, why Trump's executive order on religious liberty left many conservatives dissatisfied. This was written before it actually was released, but a lot of people had a little bit of an idea of what was in it, and it turns out that some of the initial reports indeed were correct. First, of course, it does instruct the Internal Revenue Service to exercise maximum enforcement discretion in cases of pastors and other religious religious leaders speaking about political issues. This is what is known as the Johnson Amendment, which was passed back in 1954 without a vote, really, without a debate, I should say. It was a quick vote, but it was just it was kind of a perfunctory amendment, which at that time, Senator Lyndon Johnson wanted to enact so that he could prevent some of these nonprofit groups from making it more difficult to him win re-election. And so that does provide that, and we'll talk more about what that means in just a minute. The article also talks about, second, it provides regulatory relief to religious organizations that object to a provision of the Affordable Care Act that requires most employees to cover contraception in employee insurance plans. That's the section that deals with this idea of conscience protections, which interestingly enough is the topic in this latest May issue of Outlook. But even the way it's written, it says that the Secretary of Treasury, the Secretary of Labor, the Secretary of Health and Human Services shall consider issuing amended regulations. Really? That's pretty weak. But that is at least in there, and then it also declares it's a policy of the administration to protect and promote religious liberty. Okay, so far so good, but not a whole lot. And so it is very different than this original draft, which we talked about back in February. This was a draft of an executive order that it sounded like Donald Trump was going to sign. It was leaked to the nation, and in some respects, it was something which I think a lot of the liberals and even civil libertarians wanted to use so that they could begin to raise all sorts of fuss and thus prevent any kind of possibility that it would be passed. And if indeed that is the case, and I think there's pretty good evidence to suggest that it was indeed the plan, it worked pretty well. Matter of fact, some people have even said that it's possible that Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner, who have tried to project themselves as friendly to the LGBTQ community, that this is why it was leaked. And so as a result, what we end up with is something that is much less significant than the original draft order. As a matter of fact, of course, as I mentioned, President Trump hosted members of his Religious Advisory Council at a dinner last night in the White House. This includes all sorts of people that we've interviewed on this program, people like Franklin Graham and Jack Graham and Ronnie Floyd and all sorts of other individuals that were part of that. Greg Laurie was there. I mean, we'll go through the long list. You're very familiar with Jim Dobson and Ralph Reed and Robert Jeffress and on and on and on. So as people have begun to find out about this, you haven't exactly had a lot of people saluting it. We oftentimes quote from David French. He is a writer for National Review and on a Twitter account called it total weak sauce and a sop to the gullible. That's not too good. Russell Moore, head of the public policy arm of the Southern Baptist Convention of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, told individuals that I am hoping that the draft we're seeing this morning is not the entire project, that more will be forthcoming. And that we will get to in just a minute is kind of the argument being made by John Smirek that Trump's executive order is a baby step in the right direction. But Ryan Anderson, who's a scholar at the Heritage Foundation, works on these issues of religious liberty, called the whole order woefully inadequate. So let me try to explain why some people are saying that. If you go back to the original draft that actually Ryan Anderson put together, he ended up kind of summarizing the draft executive order as having 10 points. And so let me work our way through it and just show you that maybe we get 3 out of 10, assuming that my count is accurate. The first is that original draft order and this one both require federal departments and agencies to respect the statutes and Supreme Court decisions that make clear that we have free exercise of religion, and that applies to all people, all faiths, all places, all times. Okay, so far so good. That's kind of almost a perfunctory one, but it's not insignificant. It's, again, an illustration of what has happened because you have a President Donald Trump. I doubt any of this would come from maybe President Hillary Clinton. So that's the first section there, and that is certainly worthwhile. Then you have a second section that deals with what we call the Johnson Amendment, which would effectively roll back the Johnson Amendment that by instructing the Treasury Department to ensure that it does not revoke nonprofit tax status because a religious group speaks on politics. Win in the sense that I can't really come up with more than one church in the last 20 plus years that has even lost its tax-exempt status for a day. There was one that did lose it for a day because it had posted some things about President Clinton, but it was certainly reinstated instantaneously. So even though that's a potential threat, it hasn't been much of one, and each year we talk about these various groups working with Alliance Defending Freedom that actually will have pastors address issues in September dealing with political issues, then sending those transcripts to the IRS, hoping that one of them might get sued so that then they would have standing. And so far, that hasn't been very effective. And then the third one is, of course, the instruction to the Secretaries of Health and Human Service, Treasury, Labor, and others to grant relief to groups like Little Sisters of the Poor. And those standing next to President Trump today were the Little Sisters of the Poor and others who were not exempted from the mandates on contraception and abortifacients. And so this would affect Hobby Lobby and Sisters of the Poor. But of course, you already theoretically have the Supreme Court decision on Hobby Lobby. So if you're keeping account, those are the three that are actually in this executive order. What was left out? Well, let me just mention those real quickly before the break, and then I'd love to get your comments about whether you think this is a good first step, whether you think this is sufficient, whether you, like some others, are discouraged, and how you think this should play itself out in the future administration in terms of religious liberty. Because certainly there were some other statements here. For example, the original draft order instructed agencies to the greatest extent practical and permitted by law to reasonably accommodate the religion of federal employees as required by Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. You can begin to see how that's important. Kelly Shackelford will be here with us tomorrow, and we can talk about federal employees, for example, those in the military. And one of them, Monica Sterling, who was court-martialed simply because she had on her computer a verse from the book of Isaiah, which was enough for her to get court-martialed. And so that case may even make its way to the Supreme Court. Another one was a statement that consumers buying health insurance on the Obamacare exchanges have the option to buy plans that don't cover abortion or subsidize plans that do. Now, some of that might be resolved in this vote that is taking place today on repeal and replace of Obamacare, but that will be interesting. Another one would prohibit the federal government discriminating against child welfare providers such as foster care or adoption services based on the organization's religious beliefs. In other words, as we have seen in the past, if a homosexual couple, as they did in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, went to Catholic Charities and said, we would like to adopt a child, Catholic Charities said, well, we don't agree with that, but we'll actually refer you to an agency that will allow you as a homosexual to adopt. That is not sufficient, and they were driven out of business. This would be a protection on that, but that's not in this draft or even in the final executive order. And then another one would be the so-called Russell Amendment, which actually instructs agencies to allow religious organizations to hire in accordance with their faith principles. Again, if you're a church or a Christian organization and you would disagree with the lifestyle, the sexual proclivities, or various sexual activities of an individual, you would be protected. Well, again, this might be something that Congress would have to deal with, but it is completely eliminated from this particular executive order, as well as many others that might have been a protection for those individuals that are bakers, photographers, wedding planners, a variety of others, florists. So again, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation about this presidential executive order on religious liberty. But I'd love to hear your comments. What are your thoughts? If you'd like to weigh in with your comments, that number is 1-800-351-1212. We'll open up the phones in this last half hour. An open line for your comments. All that coming up right after this.
In an age of fake news, getting good information is vital. Point of View works to bring you that each and every day. But as Diane in Arkansas illustrates, passing that information along, educating others, is something you can help with. Diane is a college professor. She influences the next generation, and she wrote, "Thank you for your informative letter. I used some of your quotes when I was teaching the Declaration of Independence in my literature class." Diane, like so many, hopefully like you, is taking what she received from Point of View in letters, online, through our app, on the air, and rebuilding truth in this post-truth culture. All of that takes a team. Join the Truth Team at Point of View. Find out how you can help at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or sign up online at pointofview.net/team. Show your commitment. Make a difference today, right now. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Been a very busy day. We, of course, spent some time talking about the National Day of Prayer. We've been talking about this executive order promoting free speech and religious liberty. Now the House of Representatives just passed the American Health Care Act. That would be the repeal. That we will get to as well. So we have lots of issues to cover here. And let me just mention for a minute that there is, as I mentioned a moment ago, some level of disappointment because this particular executive order should have covered more. Even that being said, you've had positive statements that came from Dr. Jerry Johnson of the National Religious Liberty saying for a number of years the value of religious beliefs and their free expression in daily life was at best an afterthought for many political and corporate entities, and even worse, the subject of attack. The treatment of Hobby Lobby and Little Sisters of the Poor was just the tip of the iceberg as examples of hostility when one's faith did not fall in line with the dogma of the radical left. Goes on to talk about ministries know that they will not be targeted. But on the other hand, of course, you can find all sorts of criticisms that have come from individuals that I think before they read the executive order would be expected to oppose it. This would be, for example, Americans United for Separation of Church and State. They said the harm the executive order could cause to real people is hard to overstate. It reads like a wish list put together by Vice President Mike Pence and his allies, who are among the forces leading the charge to discriminate against LGBTQ people. I think as they read this order, they're going to go, maybe there's not so much to complain about. After all, Human Rights Campaign has said some critical things as well, but maybe when they look at how vanilla some of this order is, they're not going to necessarily fuss and complain quite so much. And I have a piece here by John Smirek who uses a good example. Imagine that you're in a prison and attorney comes in and says, you know, I'm going to try to get you out. And so you go all in, you empty your bank account to have that happen. And then he just gets moved to a more comfortable cell. And the attorney says, this is the best I can do, you know, politics. And he says, that's the story of Christian citizens and voters in 2017. We subjected by the Obama administration and a lawless Supreme Court decision on marriage to grave dangers to our free exercise of religion. And then he goes on to say that evangelical Christians voted for Donald Trump. They had the right to expect much more than this executive order. The point he makes, and the other point that's made by Gregory Baylor, who's with the Alliance Defending Freedom, is that, okay, let's give credit where credit is due. This does provide protection, but primarily it provides protection for pastors and specifically religious institutions, but it doesn't really protect millions of ordinary Christian citizens. And that gets us back to what happens to the baker, the florist, the photographer, the innkeeper, if indeed he or she just simply believes in the biblical view of marriage. So we certainly have those issues on the table, and in just a minute, I want to get to this vote that is going to be another topic we will probably address in more detail on Friday, on our Friday weekend edition, because we have now the vote that took place in the House of Representatives for the American Health Care Act, and one that actually would eliminate about $390 million of the $450 million going to Planned Parenthood. So that alone becomes a little more of a positive. But also, is it going to be passed by the Senate? And more importantly, what is the future for health care in America? So we have a lot more to cover, but let's give some of you a chance to join our conversation today. We've talked about the National Day of Prayer. We've talked about the executive order, and in just a minute, we're going to get into the issue of repealing and replacing Obamacare, defunding Planned Parenthood. But let's go, first of all, to Arkansas and talk to Jackie. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for taking my call. I'm calling to tell you about something that's going on in our city.
Okay.
We are trying to unite the churches, and they've been meeting together, and this week we had an open Monday, Tuesday, and then today prayer meeting where everybody from the city is invited. And we have, well, I don't know all of the churches, but I know we've got the Methodist, the Baptist, the Assembly of God, several non-denomination, Church of Christ that are all getting together. They're praying, and we're all praying together for the country. We prayed for the country. We prayed for forgiveness. And tonight it's on unity and healing the problems that we've got in our own. You know, if we're not right with God, how can we expect our churches to be right? So it's healing us than healing the churches and coming together united.
Well, that's very good. And again, I have found that these prayer events really can be a source of unity in a community. We may theologically have some disagreements, but certainly we can all at least agree that we are commanded in 1 Timothy 2 to pray for those in authority, and that means your president and vice president. It means your senators and your members of Congress, your Supreme Court, your governor, your state senator, your state representative. And if you want to go on and even pray for your mayor and city council and things of that nature, those are all very important aspects of that. And I believe that can cross denominational lines. So it sounds like that's what's happening to you right there in your community.
Yes, it is. And I'm very, very proud of our nation, our community. It's, God is working in it. And we're expecting big things.
Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And again, for those of you that might say, I don't know where a prayer event is, oftentimes you can go to the National Day of Prayer website and find that out. But even if you can't find that your community is having one, and sadly still there are a lot of communities that don't do this, you could be the catalyst to start one even today. You might even just simply say, well, I will gather together the few people I know and we'll just in our home pray, or we'll go to the city hall and pray and maybe encourage some other people to do so. But this is certainly one thing that I'm very encouraged about, that as we've talked about with a number of individuals, even earlier in the week with one of the guests I had, asked if he had noticed that more people seem to be praying, and Graham Watts and others have said that as well. So let me encourage you to spend time today praying for this nation. There's 7 different strategic elements of prayer that they have there, so that you are praying for the government, you're praying for media, praying for business, you're praying for a variety of different aspects of the military. And so let me encourage you to find out a little bit more about praying for this nation. Let me go back to pick up a few more phone calls real quickly. In California, KNOB, and Sandra, share with us what you would like to share today.
Yes, I wonder if you could remember a man called Pastor Seldrin. It was in the late 70s, early 80s.
I do.
Where he was heavily persecuted. And I believe Point of View, that's before you became a Point of View, picked up some of the information where he lost his tax status. And this is before homeschooling became an issue, but they realized the curriculum in the schools just simply wasn't doing the job in educating people. And I would like for you to share what you remember. I can't remember the man's first name, but I do. I pulled my children out of public school twice because it was so ugly.
Well, again, I'm trying to remember all the details of that, but maybe you can start me so I can make sure that I don't make a mistake in getting the wrong facts. But I do remember some individuals that have faced some of this issue of tax-exempt status and those kinds of things. And the hope is that this Johnson Amendment would prevent that, at least for pastors. Now, again, if you are talking about a school that was going to be losing its ability to be tax exempt in a community, that's how I remember it. It's a little different than the Johnson Amendment, but it's still an important issue, and probably a need for us to once again revisit some of those stories. And so that's about all I can remember right now, other than I think it had to do, like you said, with what was happening in his church, in his Christian school, and his unwillingness to pay some of the taxes that were actually, if I remember right, levied by the local community or by the state. It wasn't really a federal issue like the one we're talking about today. Is that true?
Oh, something similar to that, but he didn't like the curriculum of the public school because it was not doing the job.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you bringing that up, and we'll see if we can dig some of that up, because that's another part of that story in terms of taxes and responsibility. And one of the reasons why some of the churches have decided not to actually incorporate and not actually apply for a tax-exempt status is the concern that then, if the government grants you a tax-exempt status, the government can take it away. Theoretically, this executive order is going to make it more difficult, at least for the Internal Revenue Service, to do something like that. But that hasn't been a real threat to pastors in the past. If nothing away, it probably takes away an excuse that pastors sometimes have used when they don't want to talk about these issues. Let's come back and talk about this vote on health care. That coming up right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. In 1997, the Birdville Independent School District welcomed 2 students to their meetings. One student led the Pledge of Allegiance, while the other student delivered a statement of his own choosing, according to the school's policy of allowing student remarks. And that continued for years, most often in the form of an invocation during which the board members stood respectfully quiet with bowed head while the student prayed. That was all well and good until a humanist group sued, alleging the school boards are not legislative bodies and should not be permitted to have an invocation in the same way a state legislature, city council, or county commission does. Eventually, the case arrived before the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, where a 3-judge panel upheld the practice, stating, quote, legislative prayers are recited for the benefit of legislative officers. It would be nonsensical to permit legislative prayers but bar the legislative officers for whom they are being primarily recited from participating in the prayers in any way, unquote. The fact that students undertook to lead those invocations was of minimal concern. Quote, although it is possible to imagine a school board student expression practice that offends the Establishment Clause, the court explained, this one, under its specific facts, does not, unquote. This is a routine area of challenge by secularists, but one with limited success, since the long tradition of our country is one of support for prayer at public meetings. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
It's been a busy day, especially for the president and Congress. Of course, President Donald Trump actually signed an executive order promoting religious liberty and also had this National Day of Prayer. Now, those individuals who are part of the Republican leadership are heading to the White House right now. There is a celebration. Donald Trump said that if indeed this passed, they would have a celebration there. I understand they even had a case of beer that the Republicans in the House had to celebrate this, which is a little bit odd if you think about it, because this particular piece of legislation known as the American Health Care Act, or the repeal and replace of the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, passed 217 to 213 and now goes to the Senate, and it will be questionable whether or not it will pass there. But nevertheless, you had 217 Republicans vote for it. 213 voted against it, which included 193 Democrats plus 20 Republicans for that 213. And, of course, the argument that was made is that you had to bring in multiple coalitions. One were the conservatives in the House of Representatives, the House Freedom Caucus, as well as the moderates. So for just a minute, and then I thought I'd end with the prayer that was actually given today by Anne Graham Lotz. Let's talk about how that took place, because what you had, interestingly enough, are some House leaders that were not sure that we could pass this without getting some of the conservatives and a few of the moderates. One of those, interestingly enough, was Fred Upton of Michigan, as well as Billy Long of Missouri. And what they wanted to make sure that there was a provision there for people with pre-existing medical conditions. So they were able to get an amendment to this bill that will add another $8 billion over 5 years but nevertheless would provide a $130 billion fund to create risk pools to protect people in the individual insurance market who have high-cost treatments. And this became a bit of an issue because it was already a little bit questionable how quickly this bill would pass, or if this bill would pass, because of one of those issues I just mentioned, and that is pre-existing conditions. Now, as some people have pointed out on this program, and I even heard Rush Limbaugh yesterday getting flack for pointing this out, but it's really true, insurance and pre-existing conditions are a little bit different. Insurance is, I'm going to insure for something that might happen. Just take it out of healthcare for a minute. I'm going to insure my car as I do, so that I hope I'll never have an accident, but if I do, then I'm covered. But insurance is not where I've already had an accident and call up my insurance agents and say, I need to cover myself. They'd say, well, you've already had the accident. Pre-existing conditions is sort of a different category, and about 4%, some people say as much as 10%, I think the 4% is more accurate, of Americans have very significant pre-existing conditions. And so what do we do there? And so the argument was, let's, like we have done in many states, where we have a high-risk pool or we have an insurance pool, let's see if we can have that nationally, and that's why Fred Upton and others argued for that. So once that happened, then, of course, you also, in the background, had some provisions that the Freedom Caucus, those would be the conservatives in the Freedom Caucus, wanted to actually enact, and were able to get those amendments added. And so it then looked like it was quite possible that you would get the possibility of actually passing this particular American Health Care Act. And then Jimmy Kimmel. We talked about this yesterday, but let's get back into it as well. On his talk show, late night talk show, Jimmy Kimmel gave a really powerful and emotional story about his child. And you might remember that his child first had a heart murmur, and then it was necessary for him to have emergency heart surgery. And so as he shared this very powerful story, one that all of us could relate to, he then, instead of talking about, this is a reason why I am so grateful we had doctors at Cedar Sinai Hospital. I'm so grateful that we have this kind of medical technology here in the 21st century. Instead, ended with something very different and used this as why we need to make sure that we have all sorts of provisions for pre-existing conditions, and why we cannot possibly remove and replace the Obamacare provisions. If anything, we need to move to universal health care. And of course, the emotional power of that argument, I think, was something, if for no other reason, as illustrated by how his video went viral, and which caused a lot of Republicans to say, I'm not sure we can pass this bill now in light of some of the emotional arguments being used. And of course, a lot of the House Democrats use this to say, this is why we cannot actually get an up or down vote on this issue of the American Health Care Act. Well, the Health Care Act has passed, and so it moves now from the House to the Senate, and we'll follow what will happen next. And of course, we'll talk about much more of this tomorrow on our weekend edition with Penna Dexter and Kelly Shackelford. But I thought I would end, if I have enough time, with the national prayer that was issued today by Anne Graham Lotz, who is the chairperson for that. And she begins by saying, we worship you, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. You are the living God of our nation's founding fathers, George Washington, John Adams, John Hancock, Benjamin Franklin, Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, and many others. When we pledge our allegiance as one nation under you, every time we use American money to buy or sell, we make a statement that in you we have placed our trust. She goes on to say, we acknowledge that you are the one who has set us high above all the nations on the earth. You've made us head and not the tail. We have led the free world. The whole world has known that we are identified with you, and they have respected us. She goes on to say, again and again, you have given us victory over our enemies. You have blessed us when we have gone out and when we have come in. You have blessed us in our bustling cities, in our beautiful countryside. You have blessed our fruited plain so that we have had an abundance for ourselves and for others. You have opened up the storehouse of your bounty and have blessed the work of our hands. You have given us unprecedented prosperity, so that in the past we have lent to many nations, but have been a debtor to none. That is a quote, actually, interesting enough, from Deuteronomy 28. Then she goes on to say, we now turn to you as God of our fathers. You alone are our hope of the future. If we as a nation do not get right with you, no one in Washington or our state capitals can reverse the downward moral and spiritual spiral that has become a free fall and is provoking your judgment. We approach you now with fear and trembling as we confess our national sins. Then she goes through those. We confess our addiction to money, to pleasure, to sex, to pornography. She goes on to say, we confess that we no longer fear you. We confess that our foolishness of denying you are the one and true living God. We confess our greed that has run up trillions of dollars of national debt. We confess our arrogance and pride. We confess bringing our prosperity of our nation has been a great because we are great rather than refusing to acknowledge the blessings from your hand. And goes on with a whole series of confessions and then concludes by saying, therefore we turn to you with tears of shame and a heart of fear for the judgment we are provoking. We repent of our sin. Please, God of our fathers, do not back away from us. Do not remove your hand of blessing on us as we return to you with humility, with sincerity, out of necessity, with a desperate sense of urgency. Please return to us, hear our prayer, forgive our sin, heal our land. So if nothing else, this was a very powerful prayer that she issued today. Other individuals also offered those prayers on the National Day of Prayer, and let me encourage you to do the same in your community. You don't necessarily have to gather together in a group, although that certainly is an opportunity, and many of you may be going to church tonight to do so, but certainly we call for you to pray for this nation. Let me again thank Andrew, Alisa, as well as Shamila for their help behind the scenes. We look forward to hearing more from our roundtable guest on our Friday weekend edition. We'll see you back here tomorrow on Friday.
A 2013 survey asked people around the world whether sex without marriage is morally wrong. Every country where more than 90% said, yes, it's morally wrong, Islamic. The worst two, tied at 6% saying it's wrong, France and Germany, the nations of Calvin and Luther. Catholic Italy, 11%. Simply sad. The United States, well, 31%. Not even 1 in 3 thinks extramarital sex is morally wrong. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.